What we're doing in this series of messages is looking at the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is about creation and about how things began. It tells us that God began everything, and it tells us why He began everything. And that means we get to some of the most foundational issues there are. In the book of Genesis, we get down to the basic features and aspects of human existence. We get at answers to the big why questions and the what for questions that have plagued us for centuries. And today what we want to look at is one of the things that keeps coming up, words that keep coming up in Genesis 1 and 2, work and rest. And this morning one of my sons came in and said, "Dad, what are you preaching on today?" And I said, "Work." And there was this pause, and I said, "It's more interesting than it sounds." Because, who wants to hear a sermon on work? But you know what? That's an awfully relevant subject, especially to people in this room, especially if you live or work in New York. Early on in when we first got here, early on in our time in New York, and I don't remember who I was talking to. I just remember the words. I don't remember the speaker. But I remember I was complaining about the fact that, I'm working so hard. I'm just working much harder than I ever worked in any other ministry anywhere else. And I just remember, I think it was a man, he looked at me and he said, "Well, nobody comes to New York to get a life." If you come to New York, you come to work. If you don't come to work, you might as well leave. And, there's a lot of, for at least 150 years, that's absolutely true. Immigrants come to New York and try to get into this whole new American society. And how do they do it? How do they enter into this new American society? Through an enormous amount of work. And then there's hundreds of thousands, maybe not millions of immigrants, but hundreds of thousands of people who live in America, or are already in American society, come to New York in order to make it into one of the professions, and to make it in their career, and make it in their field. And of course that means everybody's working, but I'll tell you, somebody in the last 5 to 10 years has turned it up several notches, and not just in New York. Something's going on with work in this culture. Something's going on. The 40-hour work week, what was that? Do you remember that? Do you remember when we actually did have 5 days shut-down labor and 2 days off? We don't know what it is. And I'm reading all sorts of things. I'm reading it's the new economy. I'm reading it's technology, cell phones, email. There's all sorts of villains. I don't know what the villains are, but something's going on. Probably the main villain we're going to talk about here today. It's not technological. It's not sociological. It's emotional and spiritual and theological. But something's going on. Work is becoming a personal spiritual crisis issue. Remember when you used to just eat when you ate? Is there anybody in New York that only eats when they eat? I never eat I don't just eat when I eat. I'm always doing something else. You feel like you're wasting time if you just eat when you eat. You do something else when you eat. Do you remember the rhythms? There was rhythms of work and rest and work and rest. We worked in the day. We rested in the evening. We worked in the week. We rested on the weekends. And that's all gone. There's no rhythms left. Something's going on. The rhythms are gone of work and rest. The neighborhoods are gone. Nobody ever sees anyone else. Families, in many senses, are gone. Something's going on with work. And yet here in Genesis 1 and 2, I told you it's more interesting than it sounds at first. Genesis 1 and 2 is saying, because work and rest come up in the very beginning of things, Genesis is saying that getting and understanding work and rest is at the very heart of things. It's at the very essence of living a human life. Understanding work and rest is a life and death issue. So what do we learn here about work and rest? And let's lay it out like this. The text is teaching us, first of all, what we're called to do, which is work, and how we're called to do it. But then lastly, what we need in order to do it. What we're called to do, and how we're called to do it, but what we desperately need in order to do it. And the answer to that, of course, is rest. You're never going to work unless you get rest. But it's a much more profound statement in Genesis and in the Bible than it sounds the way I just put it. Let's look at these three things. What we're called to do, how we're called to do it, and what we need in order to get it done. Number one, what we're called to do. First thing we see here is that when we're made, in the very beginning, we're called to work. Again, I had to apologize to my son this morning by saying, I know that doesn't sound all that exciting, but actually there is something radically stunning and exciting and positive about what this text tells us about work. First thing we see, look at verse 2:2. It says, when God, this is the very seventh day, by the seventh day God had finished the work he'd been doing. Do you know how radical that is? Do you know, as one of the commentaries I was reading said, do you realize what an intellectually radical statement this was when this was written? If you look to Eastern accounts of creation, I mentioned, I think, last week, the Enuma Elish. That's a famous Babylonian account of creation. And in that account, there's a battle of the gods, and Marduk, the king of the victorious group, creates the world as a kind of monument to his victory. And Marduk is creating the world by slitting open the body of the god that he destroyed, and he creates the heavens and the earth. And all the other gods come in, and he says, now we're going to live in this. We can come and go into this new world, this universe I'm creating. And they say, do you realize what it'll take to keep that up? We're afraid if we go in there, we're going to end up, having to keeping up the world. It'll be an awful lot of work. And Marduk says, oh, I know it. And this is what he says in the Enuma Elish. He says, I will bring into being a lowly primitive creature called man. Man shall be his name, and to him shall be charged the labor, so that the gods may have rest. So you see, in the Enuma Elish, in the Eastern accounts of creation, work is completely bad. Gods don't do work. Let humans do work, so we can rest. Completely different than this, but let's go on the other side. On the other side, let's look at Western ancient accounts. Look at the Greeks and the Romans. There's a number of great myths the Greeks have about origins, and one of the most famous is Pandora's box. You know that Zeus gives Pandora this jar, actually, this box we call it today, and says, don't you open it. And she opens it, and what comes out? All the bad things, everything that's wrong. Death, disease, decay, and work. See, in the Greek myth, work is in Pandora's box. Work comes out with death and disease and everything else. Now, what is going on here? Genesis 1 is almost deliberately going in the teeth, right in the teeth, of what both Western and Eastern, what everybody else ever thought about work. It's saying work is something God does. Work is something good. In fact, what's really astounding is look at chapter 2, verse 7. The Lord formed God, the man, from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Now, we all know, do we not? Or let me remind you of what you learned in school. The Greeks and the Romans understood the soil as being bad. The physical as being bad. The soul is good. You see, the soul is good, the soil is bad. Listen carefully. The soul is good, the body's bad. The body is the prison house of the soul. And Xenophon and Cicero and Socrates and everybody taught that manual work, therefore, was demeaning. Work was bad as it was. It was a curse. It was in Pandora's box. It was not something good. It was a curse. It's a punishment. But if you have to work, stay out of the dirt. You don't do manual work. Even, by the way, Socrates said, even retail is demeaning. He says what you want to do is to avoid work completely, or else be a teacher or be a philosopher. Get into the information industry, basically, is what Socrates said. And here what we have is, almost deliberately, the book of Genesis shows us God with dirt under his fingernails. God digging a ditch in order to create us. And then, of course, in 2:15, God plants a garden, God has his hands dirty, and then he puts us and says, you be a gardener. Now, all this is so radical. All this is unbelievably radical. Genesis is going out of his way to say, look how good work is. Work is in the paradise. Here's paradise, the Garden of Eden, paradise. And what's in there? Great food. You see that? Beautiful things for the eye to look at. So you have food, and you have beauty, and you have, as we're going to see, you have spirituality. They walk with God in the cool of the garden. And you had sexuality, and you had friendship, and work. Work is put in paradise. Not only work is put in paradise, not only is work not a punishment, but all work is held up. Even what we call today menial work, manual work. No matter how high and lofty your position is in society today, Your ancestor was a groundskeeper. In other words, if you have this huge house at the Hamptons, you know those people, you don't even know their names, who take care of your grounds? That's your cousin. That's your ancestor. That's your father. See? There has never been, except for one person I know, there's never been another major thinker, there's never been another major thought form that had this high view not only of work, but of all work. And all workers. So that even, the gardener, even the menial ditch digger, is held up like this. The only person who had this high view of work was Karl Marx. Karl Marx says the worker, the common worker, he held him up. But you see, here's the problem. Marxism is deeply discredited today, is it not? Completely out. Why? I would suggest it's because Marx didn't ground his high view of work in a God who loves to get his hands dirty, and a God with his hands in the dirt. He didn't ground this high view of work in the love of a God whose Son came not as the Greeks would expect him to come as a philosopher, or as the Romans would expect him to come as a noble statesman, or as the Jews wanted him to come as a great general, but as a carpenter. A union guy, okay? Marx didn't ground it in that. Marx basically grounded his high view of work in atheism. And one of his contemporaries, Dostoevsky, who was a little more philosophically astute, said, if there is no God, everything is permitted. If there's just evolution, what's wrong with oppression? And there's no warrant for saying there's anything wrong with oppressing the workers. But you see, now that Marxism is pretty much passé, where is the source of social healing in this world? Where is it? Look at Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 and 2 says, ditch digging, lifts it up. Music, because Genesis 1, we looked at this last week, was a song. Genesis 1 and 2 is theology and philosophy. Don't you remember in the killing fields, when the workers got in charge in Cambodia, what did they do? They took the professionals and they killed them. They marched them out. Remember the killing fields? In our global capitalistic economy now, it's the unskilled manual workers who are disdained. Professionals is disdained in communism, and menial workers are disdained in capitalism. But in the Bible, all work has dignity because God does it. There's nothing more socially healing than to believe what the Bible tells us, and that is we are called to work, and we're called to all work. All work is a calling of God. All work has dignity. All work is satisfying to something God put in us. Well, let's get to that. And by the way, is there anybody who right now has a job that's considered menial? Is there anybody, are any of you parents that are spending an awful lot of times at home with your fingers in baby poop? And have you imbibed what the a new economy tells you, and that is this is not a job for anybody but a boob? Remember the God with dirt under his fingernails, who dignifies all work. And by the way, especially that work. But anyway, so the first thing is we're called to work. We're called to all kinds of work. Very radical. But then secondly, I'm going to give you, briefly, 3 things in here, 3 practical guidelines for how we should do our work. We're not only called, what are we called to do? Work. How are we called to do it? There are 3 guidelines here for working happily, for grounding our work in what the Bible tells us the nature of things is. There's 3 guidelines, and I'll just tell them to you quickly and then go through them quickly. This also works, by the way, for being happy in the job you choose, and also works in being happy in working the job you've chosen or the job you have. There's 3 things we're told here. Look in, look out, and look up. Look in at what you're gifted to do. Look out at what people need. And look up to the one who's called you. Look in, work because of who you are or what you're gifted to do. Number 2, look out, look at the world around you, and give the world what it needs to have. And look up, look at the one who's called you, and realize you have to realize what you're destined to be. You need all 3 of those things. Those are your 3 guidelines for work. Let me show you how quickly that goes. Number 1, look in. Chapter 1, verse 26. God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, let them rule. Now why? He's a ruler. He makes us in his image, and he makes us rulers. Now what's this mean? We were all made in the image of a creator, and therefore we need to create. Now this doesn't mean we all have to be artists. And as a matter of fact, listen carefully. We said last week that the Hebrew word create, which means to create out of nothing, is a word that's only used 3 times in the book in Genesis 1 and 2, and it's only ever used in the Bible of God. But there's a lot of other words like form and make and shape and separate that are not only used of God, but of us. Because creation proper is making something totally new out of no matter at all. Only God can do that. But subcreation, that's a word that J.R.R. Tolkien came up with. Subcreation means making something relatively new out of existing material. Subcreation is doing what the Spirit does in chapter 1, verse 2, which we looked at last week. The Spirit hovers over the empty void matter. And what is the Spirit doing? The Spirit's bringing order out of chaos. The Spirit is bringing newness out of undeveloped material. And every human being has a deep desire in some way to image or reflect that. You were made in the image of a Creator, and you've got to do it. What do I mean? For example, if you create a business, you're taking disparate elements, human elements, and you're creating a business that wasn't there before, or a product that wasn't there before. That's business. Number 2, you take disparate physical elements and you create a work of art, a painting or sculpture or something like that. What have you done? Number 3, you take over a terrible organization or an awful department which is sinking and losing money, and you turn it into something stable and productive again, and the jobs are saved. What have you done? Number 4, you're a teacher and you're bringing the kids' potential out. Because you're such a good teacher, you're bringing the kids' greatest potential out. You're giving them a vision. You're bringing out their abilities. You're showing them what they can do. What are you doing? Okay. You see? Number 5, you're a medical professional, and you take a disordered body and you make it orderly. A body that's sinking and falling apart, and you bring it together. Or you're a therapist or a counselor, and you take a disorderly life and you bring order out of it. You see? Or what if you just love cleaning up the yard? What if you love hairstyling, which is, what is it? Combing the hair. What are you doing when you're bringing the comb through? You are doing what the Spirit did. The Spirit brings order out of chaos, and you need to do that. Why is it so satisfying to get a job done well? Whether it's business, or whether it's teaching, or whether it's counseling, or whether it's medicine, or whether it's management, or whether it's groundskeeping, or whether it's domestic engineering, whether it's cleaning up your own house, whether it's running a comb through somebody's hair. What are you doing? Exactly what the Spirit did. Bringing order out of chaos, bringing something new, and you need that. And everybody has gifts to do that. And you've got to look inside, you've got to find out what your gifts are, and you've got to work. You've got to do it, or you won't feel human. There's been a number of really interesting articles in the New York Times recently. Just last week, there was one in the New York Times Magazine about affluenza. Do you know what affluenza is? Sudden wealth syndrome. There was an article during the summertime about the kids whose parents worked for the money and then they inherit it. And what all the articles are trying to say is this: if you have the Pandora box view of work, that it's a curse, and you say, finally I don't have to work, it won't be long before you'll feel this deep disorientation to your very humanity. You'll feel like your own uselessness is just choking you. You've got gifts, you're made in the image of a Creator, and you've got to create. You've got to make. So look inside and find a job that fits your gifts, your talents, those ways in which you image the Spirit, which you image the Creator. That's number 1. Look in. Number 2, though, look out. Because look at verse 15 of chapter 2. It says, the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. Not just work it. Not just use it. Take care of it. And this is the issue of stewardship. Now, I know that a lot of you, because you're modern, you live in a modern, or maybe postmodern, individualistic, contemporary Western society, you're really grooved on the first of these guidelines, did you? You said, yes, find work that fits my gifts. Find work that fits my heart. Something's been put in me that needs to create, needs to produce, I get into that. I like that. I want to do that. But here's the second part. The second part is, do not only find work that fulfills you, but find work that helps people. Find work for the common good. Find work that the world needs. You are stewards of the people around you. You've been given gifts for them. Now here's the way the average New Yorker says, great, I'll find a job that fits my gifts, and I'll make as much money as I possibly can, then I'll give it away. And of course, that's one way. That's the second way to do stewardship. And that's important, very important. If you make a great deal of money, you're still a steward. You're here to care for the world that God's given us and for the people around you. And if you have the talents, by the way, which you did not ask for, you did not earn, you did not merit it. For example, today, if you live in a situation, if you've got math skills and it makes you incredibly, incredibly wealthy because you know how to use those in a society that values technology and values finance, rather than people skills, which means that you change bedpans and you become a therapist or a nurse or something and you make very little money, if you just happen to have the gifts that in this particular time and place, because you were born here and not on a mountain in Tibet in the 13th century, because you're born here, you get rich, don't you think that it came to you? Don't you think that you earned it? Of course you didn't earn it. Your talents just happen to work out in such a way that you make money. Then make sure that you're generous with that money, incredibly generous, because it was given to you. But why wait till then to be a good steward? Why not take some jobs now that don't earn as much money but do an awful lot of good for people? Why not just use the garden, not just use the garden, but care for it? And the second thing you've got to do, you have to look in, but then you have to look out. What do people need? What do people need? Am I producing something that helps society? Am I producing something that helps people? That's the second thing. But lastly, look up. It's not enough just to look in and look out. It's not enough just to find a job that fits me and a job that helps people. Oh, no. There has to be a sense that you're on a mission. John Coltrane was one of the great saxophonists of the 20th century, and he was converted in 1957, and it transformed his view of work. He wrote some tremendous jazz, which was, like, for example, A Love Supreme, which was just an ecstatic outpouring of praise and thanks to Christ. He was one of the great saxophonists. He played with Dizzy Gillespie, he played with Miles Davis, and on the liner notes of A Love Supreme, back, I think, really in the 60s, he said this. He says, "During the year 1957, I experienced, by the grace of God, a spiritual awakening which was to lead me to a richer, fuller, more productive life. At that time, in gratitude, I humbly asked to be given the means and privilege to make others happy through my music, and I feel this has been granted through His grace. All praise to God." John Coltrane, in the liner notes. And one day, he played A Love Supreme. He was doing it himself as a solo, and it was the best solo. It was an incredible piece of music. It was an unbelievable rendition. And when it was over, he stepped off the podium, and he put his sax down, and for the people around him, he heard him say, "Nunc dimittis." You know what Nunc dimittis means? That's the first two Latin words in the famous prayer of Simeon in Luke chapter 2, where Simeon says, "Now lettest thy servant depart in peace according to thy word, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation." And here's what he's saying. He says, I can go now. I was put on earth to do a certain amount of things, to write a certain amount of music, to play certain things. I was put on earth to do some things, and I've done it. See, where did he get that poise? Not just by looking inside saying, oh, well, I've got the talent to be a musician. Not just by looking out and saying, in general, I want to make the world to be a better place. He was called. He knew he was called. Ephesians 2, verse 8 and 9 and 10 is fascinating. Verse 10 says this, "We are God's workmanship, created by God to do good deeds, which He has prepared beforehand for us to accomplish." John Coltrane says, I know that there are certain people I need to help. There are certain things I'm here to do. And at a certain point, he realized he'd done them. He had a sense of accomplishment. Do you see these three things? A, you look inside and realize God's given me something to do. B, you look outside and say, and I'm in the place where I need to find a job that'll, be productive to other people. And if I offer up that job based on my gifts and based on the needs of others to God, I know whatever I choose, that God's going to use it. That I'm going to be like a fingerprint. I'm going to be as unique as a fingerprint. There's certain things I have to do, and there's certain people I have to help, and there's certain accomplishments I have to accomplish that only I can accomplish. And you know you're on a mission, and you don't worry about whether you're on a mission or not. You just know, I've chosen a job that fits. I looked in, I looked out, and because I'm looking up, God's going to use me. If you work like that, you'll be happy. If you take jobs that don't fit your gifts and don't help anybody else, but they just get you up the social ladder. If you take a job that fits you and even helps other people, but there's no sense that you're on a mission. In other words, if you have all three of these things, you'll be happy in choosing a job, and you'll be happy in the job you've chosen. Now, lastly, we're not only told here what we're called to do and how we're called to do it, but now some of you are out there getting pretty grumpy, maybe. And you're saying, this is utopian. This is unrealistic. Now, by the way, I know you're right. Here, I'll tell you why. I have the best job, I know. Far better than any job I ever thought I'd ever get. And I know what you know, and that is even the very, very best jobs are unbelievably frustrating and sometimes terribly crushing and filled with all kinds of difficulty and anxiety. And you say, you haven't painted to me a realistic picture of how to work in this world. Work has been nothing but frustrating to me. Work has hurt me. Work has destroyed me. I would do anything I could just to get out of work altogether or to get into a different kind of work. You're not being realistic, but the Bible is. Maybe I haven't been so far. The Bible is. Because the Bible is utterly realistic and says, yes, you're never going to do the work you're called to. You're never going to be able to do it in this way unless you see what you've got to have in your heart of hearts in order to do work. What do you have to do? You have to rest. Now listen. God, chapter 2, verse 2, finished his work, and then he rested. And then, of course, it goes on, though we don't have it printed here, he hallowed the seventh day. It means he set it apart for us. And if you only had Genesis 1 and 2, what you would be thinking is this. It's that God is saying, you can't do your work well unless you rest. And therefore work so much and then rest and have a rhythm of rest and work. And we say, well, that makes sense. Physically, you need a rhythm of rest and work. Society needs a rhythm of rest and work. But the Bible tells us that there's more to that than meets the eye. If you really, truly want to be able to work the way I'm telling you, you need the real Sabbath rest. Psalm 95. You go to the end of Psalm 95, it's all about worship. It's the famous Psalm, Venite. Come, let us worship. And when you get to the very end, suddenly, shockingly, it says, so listen to God's voice and don't harden your heart as your fathers did in the wilderness when God said, you will never enter my rest. And if you go to Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, it says there still is a rest for the people of God. What does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. It has everything to do with work. There's a place in Psalm 3 where it says, even though there's 10,000 people on my left and my right, I lay myself down and sleep, and I awake, for the Lord sustains me. Now, the scientists will tell you, it's not the amount of sleep you need, but the depth, right? What do they call that sleep that you've got to have? You know, you could sleep and sleep and sleep for hours, but if you don't get a certain kind of sleep, you'll just go nuts. You won't be able to work. You won't be able to get anything done. What is it called? It's called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, right? But in Psalm 3, when he says, I've got all these things, all these pressures on me, I lay down and I awake, for the Lord sustains me. He's talking about an REM of the soul. He's talking about a deep rest of the soul. Why does Rocky work? Remember Adrian, he couldn't sleep the night before the big fight. Why did Rocky work? He says, I just got to go the distance. I don't even need to win. I just want to go the distance. Remember what he said to Adrian? Why? Then I'll know I'm not a bum. Why does Madonna work? She tells us in Vogue magazine, which is really one of my favorite quotes, as some of you know. I've used it before. And in Vogue magazine, she says this. She says, every time I accomplish something, I feel like a special human being, but after a little while, I feel mediocre and uninteresting again. I find I have to get myself past this again and again. My drive in life is from the horrible fear of being mediocre. I have to prove I'm somebody. Why did Harold Abrams work? Remember in Chariots of Fire? Or at least, maybe not the literal historical Harold Abrams, but the Harold Abrams that's depicted by the movie Chariots of Fire. Why did he work? Why was he running that 100-yard dash in the Olympics? He says, I got 10 seconds to justify my existence. Now what Rocky, Madonna, and Harold Abrams are showing us is there's a work under the work. Why are they working? They're not just working for a living. They're not just working for money, are they? They're not. What are they working for? Stephen Jay Gould put it like this, and he was talking about the fact that there is no God, and this is what he says. He says, we are here simply because one odd group of fish had a peculiar anatomy that just happened to be able to transform itself into legs for terrestrial creatures. We are here just because comets struck the earth and wiped out dinosaurs and gave mammals a chance. We are here just for those reasons. We yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. This explanation, he says, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating. We have to construct, therefore, any meaning ourselves. Now, he's right. If there is no God, or even if we don't have a relationship with God, how do you know you mean anything? How do you know that you have any worth? How do you know who you are? How do you know that there's any meaning in life? You have to construct it, and how are you going to do it? With your work. And therefore, there's a work under the work. Rocky just needs to know he's not a bum. Madonna just needs to know that she's interesting and not mediocre, that she's somebody. Harold Abraham has to justify his existence. That is what's making your work a mess. You realize what the burden is there? If anything goes wrong with your career, you don't have a self. If anything goes wrong with the money, you don't have a being, you don't have an identity, you don't have a meaning anymore. But you see, back in chapter 2 of Genesis, God cried out with joy, "It is finished." Why? Because he'd finished the work of creation. Centuries later, essentially the same person cried out again, "It is finished." The first time, God got rest because creation was finished. The second time, Jesus Christ on the cross cried out, "It is finished," so we could get rest. Do you get what I'm talking about? Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9 puts it like this: "We who have believed enter that Sabbath rest now. There remains a rest then for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest through faith in Christ rests from his own work, just as God did from his." Until you believe that because Jesus Christ died on the cross for you and did everything necessary to fulfill the law of God, until you believe, unlike Stephen Jay Gould, that the person whose approval you really need is God, that the significance you really need is to be significant in God's eyes, that the security you really need is to be secure in God's arms, that the approval you really need is to be approved in God's heart, and that what you're doing in work is trying to get that. That's the work under the work that's crushing you and pulling you down. Until you understand that. And until you see him not only saying it is finished on the day of creation, but finished on the day of redemption. Not only till you see that the work of creation is finished, which gives you a certain amount of rest, but the work of redemption is finished. And until you rest in that, until you know you're not a bum, already before the fight, until you know your existence is justified, already before the race, until you know that who cares if they think you're mediocre and uninteresting, Madonna, if he doesn't. You're not driven anymore, you're not pushed into the ground anymore, and finally you can just work. Work is just about work. It's not about you. It's not about your existence. Finally, you can do things just for their own sake. Do you realize that if you are creating your own meaning in work, the work is never about the work. It's about you. It's never about the people you're helping. It's about you. See, John Coltrane and Madonna, no offense, maybe Madonna's changed her heart since the Vogue interview. I don't know, but John Coltrane said when he realized that God loved him, it was now about the music and about the people whose pleasure he was giving. Through the music. But Madonna actually says, my music's about me. And no wonder it's such a burden. You will never have really good work. You will never be able to work looking in, working out, working up. You'll never have this kind of incredible happiness in work until you realize the work under the work has to be borne by Jesus. Jesus said, "Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Why? He gives us rest because he took the burden, the work under the work. He died on the cross for us. He was crushed for our iniquities. He shouldered them. Listen, how do you know if you've got the rest under the work? How do you know you have this deep, rapid eye movement rest? So that you can just work. You can choose jobs, not because they bring you up and give you a name, because they help people, because they fit your gifts. How can you know that you've really rested in the finished work of Christ? of redemption, not just the finished work of creation. I'll tell you how. You take your time off. What's so interesting is, if you don't take the physical rest, it proves that you don't have the spiritual rest. If you're just working all the time, do you know this rest? Jesus says, "Come unto me, all who are weak, weary and heavy laden. Gentle am I, humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Let's pray. Give us, Father, this great Sabbath rest that has been promised to us. Help us to see it. Help us to know it. Father, there's a lot of great work to do. We look forward to the day that we can do our art, we can do our teaching, we can do our counseling, we can do our business, we can do our work, and it be about the work, not about us. And it be about you, not about us. And it be about the people around us and not about us. We look forward to a day in which work isn't crushing us into the ground. And we ask, Father, therefore, that you would give us this deep, deep, deep internal rest so that the work and the frustratingness of the work in this world will not any longer just crush us. We ask, Father, therefore, that you would help us to be like your Son, who worked and rested in you. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
For more of this series and other resources from Timothy Keller and Redeemer Presbyterian Church, please visit www.gospelinlife.com.
Welcome to Gospel in Life. Today we're starting a special series of meditations by Tim Keller, Trusting God in Difficult Times. This new series is meant to encourage you to trust God more deeply and to meditate on His Word and what it promises, to give you strength and hope in difficult times. And now here's today's meditation.
Let me read just two verses from Psalm 11, verses 3 and 4. When the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? The Lord is in His holy temple. The Lord is on His heavenly throne. This is an excellent psalm for panicky times. In the first three verses, counselors have come to David, the king, and they've said, you've got to flee. The foundations are being destroyed. There are assassins about. People have infiltrated the palace. There's going to be a coup, and so you just need to get out of town. David, however, knows that as the king, the worst thing he could do for his people was to just flee. And therefore he refuses to panic. And in verse 4, he explains exactly how he is able to avoid panic. He says two things. He says, the Lord is in His holy temple, the Lord is on His heavenly throne. That's a reason for the mind and a reason for the heart that keeps you from panic. Let's do the reason for the mind first. The Lord is on His heavenly throne. Now, God is ruling the world. There is a plan. That's what David is reminding himself of. We modern people especially, are like the child in a car who's got a little toy steering wheel that he attaches to the glove compartment. He thinks he's steering the car, even though the parent, of course, is actually steering the car. And we are like that, especially we modern people, because we think that we're in control of the world, and therefore, if the world gets out of control, then the world is out of control. If we can't control it, then it's out of control. However, God is always in control. There's always a plan. Now, this is not a comforting idea. It's not a comforting idea unless there's a little bit of humility. I remember when we were moving from Philadelphia to New York City many, many years ago, and our children were very young. And I do remember talking to one of the children who was very upset about the fact they were going to leave their playmates behind. It's very difficult when you're a 40-year-old to talk to a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old and explain, yeah, you won't have your playmate, but we're going to a way better place. You're going to have a way better life. We're going to have terrific stuff that's going to happen to us. But there's almost no way for a 40-year-old to say to a little child something that would console him at that time. Now, the difference between God and you and me is infinitely greater than the difference between a 40-year-old and a 4 or 5, 6-year-old. And therefore, when God, in a sense, comes and says, there are some things happening right now, but I want you to know there is a plan. There is some way in which, in the long run, I am working everything out for my glory and for your good. We don't understand it any more than the little child does. But here's the thing. You will get no consolation from the idea that God is in control if you don't humble yourself to say, I am a child. And of course, there might be some things that God would know that I wouldn't know. And so, first of all, if you're willing to humble yourself like that, then the idea that God is on his heavenly throne, that is that's something for your mind that will calm your mind. But then there's also something for your heart. The Lord is in his holy temple. See, the throne of God is infinitely remote. It's up there. But the temple is here with us. And the temple was the way for you to have fellowship with God. And even in David's day, there was a temple. You could go to the temple. Psalm 27, David says, I go to the temple to see the Lord's beauty. But in the Old Testament, the reality was, if you were a worshiper, you never did see the Lord. You didn't see his glory. You weren't right in his presence, because that was behind the veil, and that was over the mercy seat. And the only person who was able to go back into the Holy of Holies was the priest, high priest, once a year on Yom Kippur, taking the blood of the atoning sacrifice. And so really, you didn't actually have that kind of access. You weren't able to really get into his presence. You weren't able to really sense his love on your heart. But now you suddenly get to the New Testament and something has changed. Because in the Old Testament, Moses said, show me your glory. And God says, I can't, it will kill you. But in John chapter 1, it says about Jesus Christ, we beheld his glory. Glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. How could that be? Well, the answer is when Jesus cast the money changers out of the temple in John chapter 2, he said, tear this temple down and I'll build it back up in 3 days. And he was talking about his body. And what does that mean? What he's saying is, I'm the temple. I'm the bridge between deity and humanity. I am the great high priest. I am the great sacrifice. Because of my death on the cross, because I've paid for your sins, the veil in the temple is ripped from top to bottom. That's what the Bible says happened the moment he died. And now you can actually go right in and you can see his face. And you can sense his presence through prayer, through faith in the gospel, through the word of God. And you can actually know his presence because the Lord is in his holy temple, and his holy temple is Jesus Christ himself, the final temple, the true temple. If you have that fellowship for your heart, if you've got that understanding of God's sovereignty for your head, you can face anything.
And now here's Tim and Kathy Keller for a short time of Q&A on today's meditation.
If God's really in control of the world, then why does he let stuff like this happen? This meaning the current moment with the worldwide pandemic. Or before that, any of the terrible things like earthquakes or cancer or just name whatever you want to. I mean, I can understand. This is not my question, obviously. It's a question that keeps coming up in conversations, and we get sent to the Gospel in Life website, which, by the way, is correspondence@gospelinlife.org if you have a question. I can understand how some bad things are the result of people's sin, but when something like this happens, well, in point of actual fact, nothing like this has ever happened, but when something of a natural disaster kind of thing happens, then how can you say that God's really got everything under control? I don't understand it. I mean, this is the question that comes up. People say they can't understand how you can say God's in control whenever. Why, if he is in control, why is he letting this stuff happen?
Now, the problem is you're channeling a lot of different people when you ask that
obviously.
question.
I'm the one that answers. This is a big secret, so now I'm letting it out to the world. I'm the one that answers the gospel, the correspondence at gospelinlight.com
and so
email.
So you'll love this answer. The answer depends. It depends on where the
I'll make
person's
sure I
coming
write that
from.
down.
See, there's a more philosophical way to ask that question. There's plenty of people who rightly have a true intellectual, philosophical question about suffering and evil. They're saying, if you have a good God, an all-powerful God, how can such a God allow all this? And there are very good philosophical answers. And I would go there if I didn't feel the person who was asking me that question was actually having a lot of suffering in his or her life at the moment. There's in the last 30 or 40 years, in the world of philosophy, there has almost been a laying to rest that objection. Almost. I mean, that is, there's still plenty of people who emotionally feel like, I can't believe in a God who would allow evil and suffering. But the philosophical objection has come down to this, and that is that if there is a God who is omnipotent and all good and all powerful, that God might have, and probably does have, reasons that we can't conceive of why he hasn't stopped it yet. So here comes the suffering. You have the God of the Bible who says, eventually I'm going to stop it. But he hasn't done it yet. And there's Alvin Plantinga and a number of other philosophers have done a wonderful job writing fairly difficult to read books, but are very, very closely reasoned, that basically say, you can't assume that because you can't think of a good reason why God would allow evil and suffering, that there can't be a good reason that we just can't perceive. And I was trying to get at that in my
point
talk.
about the child and the father
That's
trying
right.
to explain things.
That was basically trying to channel Alvin Plantinga's argument. So philosophically, it doesn't mean there can't be a God. We can struggle, just like Job did. But Job struggled with the fact that he was suffering, but he never said, well, there can't be a God. On the other hand, if the person who's asking me this question is actually suffering quite a bit themselves, I wouldn't go there, because that's just not what they need. I would go to the cross. I would say, look, without showing too much disrespect to all the other world religions, we're the only religion that has a God who actually came and involved himself in suffering in order to save us. And therefore we don't know we may not know what the reason for your suffering is, but we know what the reason for your suffering isn't. It isn't that God doesn't love you.
Didn't John Stott have a saying about that? I could never believe in a God who didn't suffer. And then there's that poem. There's a poem by Edward Shillito, I believe. Can you remember it?
I do.
Okay, well, if you remember it, you're better off than me, because I can just remember that it exists. I can't remember.
Edward Shillito, he said this. He said, it's a poem, and speaking to Jesus, he says, the other gods were strong, but thou wast weak. They rode, thou didst stumble to thy throne. To our wounds, only God's wounds can speak. And no God has wounds but thou alone. Yeah. And that's, I think, how you talk to a suffering person and say, I don't know why God allowed this, but I do know it's not that he doesn't love you.
If you found today's meditation encouraging, please subscribe below and be sure to share it with a friend to encourage them as well. And if you'd like to hear more teachings by Tim Keller, you can listen to new sermons every week at gospelinlife.com/podcast. Thanks again for watching Gospel in Life.
The teaching tonight is based on the passage that is printed in your bulletin, and it's Matthew chapter 9. It's written out, so if you turn to it with me, I'll read it. As we're beginning this fall, we're looking for 3 weeks, last week, this week, and next week, at this passage which tells us how Matthew, one of the 12 apostles, became a Christian. Let me read it to you. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Then John's disciples came and asked him, "How is it that we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said, "How can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and then they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do men pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and then both are preserved." This is God's word. Now, what we're doing is, for these 3 weeks, we're looking at this story, this account of Matthew coming to Christ. And then we're doing that in order to set up the whole year of evening teaching, because right here in the beginning of the fall, it's a good idea for us to get oriented to the basics. What is a Christian? What is Christianity? And by looking at how Jesus brought somebody to Christ himself, as we look at Matthew's coming and what Jesus says about it, we're really laying out some very important principles. And last week we looked at the first principle of what a Christian is. And that first principle was, a Christian is somebody who's called. Called. Now, without recapitulating, let me just remind you, a Christian is not somebody who has decided to take up a religion or decided to take up Christianity. A Christian is somebody who senses that he or she is being taken up by someone else. The call of God comes to a person. You're not a Christian unless you're called. Jesus comes to Matthew and says, "Follow me." And anyone who really is a Christian, either in the beginning or in the middle or certainly after the process of coming to Christ is over, you sense that you have not just sat down and decided to subscribe to a religion. You don't look at Christianity and say, "I like this." You sense that you're confronted with a person. You sense that there's some force outside of you dealing with you. Maybe in the beginning you think that you're on your way because you're seeking. In the beginning you think, "I'm thinking about Christianity, I'm thinking about these spiritual things, I'm studying, I'm going to a class, I'm reading books, I am doing it." But if Christ is calling you, at some point you'll become aware that it's not your idea. "'Tis not that I did choose thee, for Lord, that could not be. This heart would still refuse thee, hadst thou not chosen me." And that's one of the hymns that goes after that, and every Christian understands that. You're called. There's an adventure to Christianity. Okay. You haven't just decided. You know, here's 3 children sleeping in the upstairs nursery. Wendy, Michael, and John. They just think it's going to be a normal night. They don't say, "Let's have an adventure." But the adventure finds them. They keep the nursery doors open. In comes Peter Pan. They're taken away. That's every good adventure starts like that. You see, the protagonists aren't looking for adventure. Adventure comes and gets them. That's what it means to be a Christian. A Christian is somebody whose nursery doors have been blown open. A Christian is somebody who's been called. Now, secondly, and this is what we're looking at tonight, to be called means you're called away from something and you're called towards something. So how convenient. That gives us 2 more things to talk about for 2 weeks. You're called from something and to something. To become a Christian is to be confronted both by a negative and a positive. You don't understand Christianity, and you're not a Christian unless you are willing to confront both. There's a negative and a positive. Far too many people miss the negative. Far too many people say, "Well, I'm interested in Christianity." I continually talk to people who come to Redeemer, and they say, "Well, you know, I've always, I think, believed. I was raised in a church or something like that, somewhere else besides New York, and I haven't been very religious. I'm thinking about becoming a practicing Christian." "Oh, I'm pretty sure that I'm a Christian, but for many years I haven't practiced it. I'm going to put it into practice." That's the way they think. In fact, there's a lot of talk about that. Are you a practicing Buddhist? You know, are you a practicing Jew? Are you a practicing Catholic, a practicing Protestant? When I hear that, it gives me goosebumps in light of a passage like this. A lot of people think that to be a Christian means, well, you know what you should be doing, and now I'm just going to get serious about it. I'm just going to positively move out and get more intense, more prayer, more Bible study, coming to church more often, being more morally consistent. Jesus Christ tells us, the Bible tells us, that there has to be a breaking up. There has to be a breaking up of your old foundations. There has to be a revolution in the way you think about things. There has to be a smashing. Why? Because Christianity is new wine. And when you put new wine into an old wineskin, the old wineskin doesn't have the flexibility. See how the metaphor works? The new wine begins to ferment. It begins to swell. It needs space. You see, it's organically, it's chemically active, and it will smash that wineskin. And that is always the case with Christianity. You'll see Paul in Philippians 3, and we looked at this, in the morning service back in the summer at one point. Paul talks about this, and I'll return to it. Paul says, I was a religious person, and he doesn't say, well, now I became a Christian, meaning I just got something straight. I added something. I added Jesus, or I got more serious. No. He says, all the things I used to look at and thought they were to my profit, I now count them as excrement. And you know what the translation should be? That's just a nice translation. Excrement. Oh, isn't that sweet? What Paul is saying is he's saying, you know, all of my religiosity, all of the things I used to be proud of, everything that I accomplished, you know what I see it as now? It's all crap. That's what he's saying. I'm sorry if anybody's offended by that. That's what it's saying. Paul has a complete revolution in the way in which he looks at things. One of the great historical documents that's ever come down to us is about 1 page long. It's a little semi-illiterate farmer in Middlebury, Connecticut, who was converted in 1740 at an outdoor preaching service in the Connecticut River Valley. He went and heard George Whitefield, the great Episcopalian evangelist. Some of you said, what? Yes. The great Episcopalian evangelist, George Whitefield, who was preaching. And Nathan Cole writes with no punctuation and no capital letters, he writes down what happened to him that day. And the way he ends his little account is this. He says, his preaching gave me a heart wound, and by God's grace, my old foundations were broken up, and I saw that my righteousness could not save me. Now, what's he saying? You can't be a Christian unless something's been smashed. Unless your old foundations, your whole approach to yourself, your whole approach to God, your whole approach to religiosity, your whole approach to everything you've done, everything is smashed. New wine, smashing the wineskins, you see. So what is Jesus telling us here? Jesus is saying you can't be a Christian unless you're willing to be called away from what I'm going to call religion. A Christian is somebody who has been called away from mere religion. You can't be a Christian unless you see the difference between what I'm going to call here mere religion and Christianity. And somebody says, well, what does that mean? Please let me show you. Jesus teaches us here the nature of religion. Now, I'm using that term. Jesus doesn't use it, but I'm going to use it because I think it's easily the best way to put what he says. There's an old way that everybody, Jesus says, everybody, whether you think you're religious or not, whether you're an adherent of this religion or that religion, whether you insist you're an adherent of no religion, whether you think you're a liberal or you think you're a conservative, he says, everybody but me. Everybody but people who have grasped the gospel. Everybody has an approach to spiritual things called religion, and you not be a Christian until you utterly repudiate it, utterly reject it, move away, smash it. You have to be called away and see the difference between religion and Christianity. All right, well, what is that? Let me just show you here. Jesus, first of all, gives us some insight into what religion is. And then secondly, we see how Jesus smashes it. And then lastly, let's give ourselves a couple of tests by which we can judge whether or not we have moved away from religion, or to what degree we have. Look, here's 3 quick things, but they're very important. Notice, first of all, let me just lay this out. Religion is a way of dividing the world into 2 kinds of people. Religion is a way of justifying yourself. Religion is a way of approaching the power behind life. Religion is a way of dividing the world into 2 kinds of people, justifying yourself so as to approach the power behind life. Notice Jesus and the Pharisees use 2 words back and forth that are very curious. If you study the New Testament, you'll find it very curious. You notice it says, while he was having dinner at Matthew's house, tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. And the Pharisees said, why are you all eating with sinners? And on hearing this, Jesus says, it is not the healthy who need doctors, but the sick. I have nothing to say to the righteous. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Now, the reason this is curious is because elsewhere in the New Testament, both Paul and Jesus reject this way of talking about righteous and sinners. For example, Paul says in Romans 3, there is no one righteous, no, not one. And Jesus, in this very book, Matthew, in verse 19, there's a place where Jesus says to somebody, nobody's good. Don't call any human being good. No one is good but God alone. Now, if Jesus says that, and Paul says that, why are they using these terms here? I'll show you that Jesus has actually decided to enter into the use of these terms because this is how the Pharisees talk. And he's entering into these terms so that he can smash them in a minute. He's going to enter into the category so he can smash the old wineskins. But for a minute, before we see how he does that, let me just show you what's going on here. Religion divides the world into good people and bad people. Matthew was a classic example of bad people. Matthew was a tax collector. Tax collectors were Jews who collected taxes for the Romans, but it wasn't just that they were hated because they were helping the oppressors, the imperialists, but rather because they bribed, because they lined their own pockets, because they were corrupt. And it's classic for us to say, well, there's little sins and there's big sins. There's good people who do little sins. I'm a good person. I do little sins. Of course, nobody's perfect. To err is human. However, then there's the bad people who do the big sins. And everybody, religion, divides people between the good and the bad, between little sins and big sins. And what are the big sins? Well, things like bribery and extortion. Crime, traditionally, crime and sexual irregularities are big sins. And so we see the bad people in town and the good people. The good people, they do things that are wrong, but they're little sins. Now, some of you say, yes, I was raised in a town like that. One of the reasons why Saturday Night Live had has so much success with Dana Garvey's character, the church lady. You know, the church lady, prudish, dividing everybody into good and bad. I do a few little sins, but they're just little sins, but you do bad sins. And everybody laughs at that because many of us came from towns in middle America where that's exactly how everybody divided folks up. And you say, yes, but I'm beyond that. I'm a tolerant person now. I live in New York. But you see, look, I'm trying to press you on something. Religion is much more pervasive than you know. Religion is not just the way formal traditional religions operate. It's the way the heart operates. And my dear friends, the only difference between liberal and conservatives is where they divide the world. They're both religious. I was reading in the New Yorker magazine a little interesting editorial about what happened to Bob Packwood, and this is what it pointed out. It said back in the 1950s, Joe McCarthy, remember the Red Baiter? He was very much hated because of going after people and accusing them of being a communist. And it mentioned in the article that Joe McCarthy was a known sexual harasser. He was always pinching his secretaries on their breasts. He was always trying to embarrass them with dirty jokes. He was always doing that sort of thing, but he was faithful to his wife. It says people tried very hard to bring Joe McCarthy down, but nobody even thought about that. Nobody ever thought about bringing that up. Why? Because back then, that was a little sin. If you were faithful to your wife, but you harassed your secretaries and you were oppressive to women in that kind of way, that was a little sin. Being faithful to your wife, that was important. Adultery was a big sin, but sex outside of marriage was a big sin. Sexual harassment was a little sin. Now, the New Yorker magazine says it's just reversed. It says now this is a big sin. The sexual harassment is a big sin. And sex outside of marriage is not enough to keep you out of office, but this is. Now, here's what the point is. The point is, I'm not trying to say how stupid that is. I'm trying to say that the difference between a liberal and a conservative is that you divide the line. You say, these are big sins, these are little sins. I only do little sins. I don't do the big sins. They're the bad people. They're what's wrong with this world. They're what's wrong with this country. I'm okay. Everybody does it. You can say you're a skeptic. You could say, I'm not religious at all. But religion is the pervasive way that you divide the world up. And why do you do it? You do it because you want to justify yourself to the power behind life. Now again, I'm trying to point out that this is pervasive. What I mean is, in traditional conservative formal religion, this means the reason that you do these great things, the reason that you stay out of big sins and you only have little sins and you do all your religiosity, is so that you can say, God owes me. When I pray, God owes me. I have sacrificed. I've made sacrifices. I've just said no all over the place. I've just said no to this and said this and this. I believe in traditional values. I've done all these things. I go to church. I tithe. I fast. I do all these things, and therefore, God owes it to me to save me. God owes it to me to hear my prayers. God owes it to me. Okay? That's religion. You convince yourself you're better than other people so that you can say, God owes me. Now, let's take a look at what many people call skepticism. There's plenty of people who say, I'm not religious, and I'm trying to show you are. Everybody is. Let's say, well, I don't even believe in a God. But, all right, let me give you I know a couple people who are atheists. Very, very thoughtful, well-worked-out atheists. One's a man, one's a woman. They both have wanted to be married, and they're pretty upset about the fact that they're not yet. Nobody here. Well, maybe, but... Now, they feel it's unfair. They're not just distressed. They're mad. Why? They feel like this is unfair. There's a lot of people who are far less diligent, kind, tolerant. In other words, there's a lot of people that you feel superior to who are having a better life than you, and you're ticked, and you're mad, and you feel like it's not fair. Now listen, let me just show you. You can intellectually say, I don't believe there's a God, so therefore I'm not religious. If there's no God, what are you mad about? How dare you say life's not fair? What the heck is fair? Everything is just